Okay, now that we have our 10 kind of important terms or concepts down, what I want to do in the next two videos is I want to give you kind of the Keynesian perspective in this video, and then I'll give you kind of the classical perspective or response in the fifth and final video. Okay, so Keynesian response. Now you'll recall that, let me draw a picture of an economy, right? So we have some aggregate demand, we have some short-run aggregate supply, and there's some level of, so this is a price level, and this is some quantity of real GDP. All right, so there's some amount of output that's being produced by this economy in the short run, and how's this economy doing? Yeah, we don't know, right? Because what are we missing? We're missing full employment potential or the long run. And if in fact I put it like this, and here's sort of the long run potential, then what's going on with this economy? Well, the quantity of real GDP that's being produced in the short run is less than the full employment potential, and we have a gap there, right? And this gap is called a what? A recessionary gap. So the economy is lagging, it's not producing to its full potential. So what would the Keynesian response be in terms of fiscal policy? Well, the policy runs counter-cyclical, meaning it runs counter to the business cycle. So in this case, if the business cycle is in contraction, then the fiscal policy response would be expansion or expansionary. Now, what does that mean? I'll tell you what that means. For a Keynesian, it means shifting aggregate demand off to the right. So how do you do that? Well, you'll recall that aggregate demand is the expenditures of the different sectors of the economy. So consumption spending by households, interest spending by businesses, or investment spending by businesses, and then government spending. And so an expansionary policy, fiscal policy during a recessionary gap would be, the government can't force households or firms to spend money, but the government can spend more money itself. So it would be an increase in government spending. So an increase in government spending, or the government could, or decrease in taxation. And each one of those effects, either one of those effects, would have the effect of increasing aggregate demand and bringing it back into to equilibrium, okay? So just as the response for a recessionary gap would be expansionary fiscal policy, then if in fact this were an inflationary gap, then the fiscal policy response would be contractionary policy. So in other words, do those things that would shift aggregate demand back to the left to try to bring the economy back into equilibrium. Now, between you and me, real world, Congress doesn't often do a lot of contractionary fiscal policy, but they're real big on expansionary fiscal policy. And in fact, that's what we've seen recently with a downturn in economic productivity is some of these policies, okay? So, important that you understand that. Let me give you an example, a couple of examples. So what would a automatic, we just talked about the definition between automatic and discretionary spending. So an automatic expansionary solution would be like unemployment, right? So unemployment, the economy tanks, goes into either a recession or lags behind. Unemployment payments increase as more people apply for them. So unemployment would be a really good example of an automatic expansionary policy. The other example I used in the video before in terms of the stimulus, right? Congress voted on the stimulus. That would be a discretionary expansionary policy because, again, it's intended to increase aggregate demand and shift it out to the right. Okay, now, having said all that, let's continue talking about the Keynesian, because the Keynesian perspective on this in terms of how to close gaps. So I'm going to leave this right like this, and I'm going to put some numbers to it. Okay, so let's say, I'm just going to make up some numbers here. Let's say that the economy is producing at, I don't know, 100 billion, something like that. But the potential, right, is 150. So how big is the gap? Well, 150 minus 100 is we have a 50, I guess, $billion gap. So how can we close that? Now here's kind of the good news, bad news. If you've read chapter 9, you know that there's a whole section in there about solving for equilibrium like you had to do in chapter 8. And in fact, we talked about before in the Keynesian chapter, you guys solved for the break even, and then you solve for a two-sector economy equilibrium. Well, in this chapter, it introduces the government, and normally you have to solve for this. Well, guess what? Well, we're not going to deal with that this semester. So I'm not gonna cover that because you're not responsible for it. So read it in the book, but don't worry about it. It'll suffice it to talk about the multipliers. Okay, so how are we gonna close that gap? Well, the multiplier, the idea of the multiplier, we talked about this in class, is that in the Keynesian model, a dollar injected into an economy has a greater effect than just a single dollar, right? And how, for your spending multiplier, pay attention to this, your spending multiplier is simply 1 over marginal propensity to save. Okay, so if I give you, so let's go back to our example here. We have to close that gap using the spending multiplier. So how much increase in government spending would have to occur to close that gap? Well, the answer is not 50 billion, right? Because of the multiplier. How do we figure out our multiplier? Well, in this example, if I tell you that your MPC is 0.9, what does that mean? Well, recall that the marginal propensity to consume plus marginal propensity to save always equals 1. So 1 minus 0.9 means your MPS is 0.1. So 1 divided by 0.1 is equal to 10. So if the multiplier is 10 and we want to close a $50 billion gap, the multiplier is 10. What times 10 equals 50? 5. So the solution here would be an increase in government spending, that's expansionary, of $5 billion using the multiplier. 5 times 10 will close, right? Because it'll shift aggregate demand right and close up that gap and bring the economy back into equilibrium. And that's the kind of short version of the Keynesian perspective. Okay, so now, let me stop right here, and I'll be back for the 5th and final video.